Hi, I'm Ashley Morell. I'm the Associate Director for Policy at JPAL Africa. My work over the last 6 years has focused on scaling up teaching at the right level in Africa, and so that's what this presentation will focus on. I'm going to talk about four things. So firstly, I'll talk about schooling for all and learning for few, which is a common phenomenon across several sub-Saharan African countries. Then I'm going to talk about teaching at the right level as a potential way to get us from schooling for all to learning for all, and teaching at the right level in Africa, and I'll wrap up with some questions that we still need to answer through the Teaching at the Right Level learning agenda. So what we see across several education systems in sub-Saharan Africa is tremendous progress at getting kids into school, as you can see from the left-hand side graph. But unfortunately, we don't see the same kinds of improvements in learning. So as you can see in the graph on the right-hand side, this is the percentage of grade 5 students who are unable to do a grade 2 numeracy problem like the one in the example box. As you can see, children in this sort of middle primary bracket, many of them are unable to do this basic math skill. And we also see that there's large variation across these different African countries. When researchers and organizations were faced with this conundrum of children being in school but not learning, they turned to inputs. And there were a series of studies that were conducted on input interventions, flip charts, extra teachers, extra computers, libraries. And what these evaluations found is that, unfortunately, business as usual inputs are not enough to increase learning outcomes on their own. One study in particular, which was done by Michael Kramer, Sylvie Moulin, and Paul Glover, found a particularly interesting finding. This was a study in Kenya on textbook provision, and while it did not increase average test scores overall, it did increase test scores for the top 40% of the class. And this revealed something about what was happening in education systems, which is that they tend to serve top-performing learners. And this may be because there are a number of structures in place that enable this to happen, such as high-stakes primary leaving exams, teachers who have a wide range of learning levels within their class, and an emphasis on covering the official curriculum rather than learning basic competencies. This is often mirrored in the households where parents will often focus their effort on top-performing students. So what happens in education systems is that we see that lots of children miss out on something in the early years and they never have an opportunity to catch up. So what does teaching at the right level do in this respect? Teaching at the right level is an approach that was pioneered by education NGO at Pratham. And at its core, it's made up of three simple steps. Firstly, assessment. Children are assessed using an oral one-on-one test. Then there is grouping into learning level groups. And finally, a focus on foundational skills at a point in the education system where children generally would have moved on from basic reading and maths. This approach is supported by a number of different components, such as how implementation teams are built, the role of assessment throughout the education system, the classroom methodology, and the emphasis on monitoring. This approach has been refined over several years. For 15 years, JPAL and Pratham have worked together to evolve a strong teaching at the right level approach through a process of experimentation and learning. This timeline shows a number of different randomized evaluations that were conducted on teaching at the right level delivery models. There are 6 RCTs that were conducted in 7 states in India, and there was also a randomized evaluation of a program that was inspired by teaching at the right level in Ghana. The first set of evaluations are really a proof of concept. They're wanting to understand whether if one assesses groups by learning level and focuses on the basics using a standard sort of classroom methodology, whether learning outcomes improve. And what those evaluations find is that teaching at the right level did work. It did improve learning outcomes. But these models focused on volunteer facilitators or high school graduate facilitators who were either working after school or during the holiday or pulling some kids out of the class. And so they weren't able to reach all children. So the next set of studies really focuses on trying to identify scalable solutions. So here, Pratham and JPAL were particularly interested in thinking about how government teachers could be effective deliverers of the teaching at the right level approach. And there were a number of different interventions which were trialed, some around material, teacher training, a combination of material, teacher training, and volunteers. And what these studies find is that Teachers can be effective deliverers of teaching at the right level approach, but training and material on their own are not enough. Teachers also need a dedicated time where they can focus on teaching at the right level and foundational skills, and they also need strong mentoring and monitoring. But how one might think about these teaching at the right level lessons in other contexts, maybe contexts like in Africa. Here you might want to try and think about the generalizability framework. So Rachel Glenister and Marianne Bates wrote a paper called The Generalizability Puzzle, where they present a framework for thinking through whether global lessons could be applicable in new contexts. In this paper, they talk about using a combination of information, which involves evidence from randomized evaluations, as well as process data and theory to assess whether or not a particular intervention may be helpful in a new context. They focus not on the geography in which the evaluation was conducted, but rather they focus on what these evaluations tell us about human behavior. So if we were in a context of low learning levels and you were interested in thinking about whether teaching at the right level could be helpful in this context, the first thing you may want to do is look at generalized lessons on behavior. We know from a plethora of evidence that children learn faster when the level of instruction is at their level, and that teachers find it hard to teach across many levels in one class. This is especially the case when systems and structures implicitly incentivize teaching to the top of the class. But in addition to this, one would also need to look at local conditions, as we know that for teaching at the right level to be useful or effective, certain local conditions need to be in place. You may want to ask, are children in school but not learning well? Is there a high variation of learning within the classroom? Are teachers focusing on completing the curricula despite the fact that many children are falling behind? If this is the case, there's the potential that teaching at the right level may be a useful intervention in that context. But we also know that teaching at the right level implementation is incredibly important in order for the program to be effective. So you may want to trial the teaching at the right level approach through a pilot in a new context and collect process data to assess that implementation, checking whether children are grouped by learning level, that teachers are teaching to the level of the group, and that children are moving through the groups as they progress. If this is all the case, learning levels should rise. We've been working in Africa using the generalizability framework thinking with partners about how teaching at the right level could be helpful in different contexts. This began in 2015, where we worked together with Pratham and other partners with the Ministry of General Education in Zambia to think about whether teaching at the right level could be useful, and then worked on designing a pilot of the teaching at the right level approach. Subsequently, there were several teaching at the right level pilots which were launched across the continent. And in 2019, Teaching at the Right Level Africa, a joint venture by Pratham and JPAL, was formed to support partners working to address the learning crisis in primary schools in Africa through the evidence-based Teaching at the Right Level approach. Today, Teaching at the Right Level works directly with governments in Cote d'Ivoire, Nigeria, and Zambia, as well as with partners across the continent who are delivering Teaching at the Right Level directly or working with governments to do so. The countries colored in the map on the right-hand side are the places in which teaching at the right level is active. But if we zoom into Cote d'Ivoire, Nigeria, and Zambia, where we're working most closely, what do we see? We see that there does seem to be a need for the teaching at the right level approach. This is an example of the Hausa assessment. It's a reading assessment. There's similar reading assessments across all of these different countries, but this one is from Nigeria. And as you can see, it's quite a simple assessment. It's broken up into these different sections of letters, words, a paragraph, and a story. And children are assessed using this tool to understand their reading level. On the right-hand side, you see data from baseline in the pilots in each of these different countries. So this is data from a few years back in many instances. And in the green, you can see the children who are at paragraph and story level. As you can see, many children are not at that level, even though the focus is on middle to upper primary. And so there is a need for teaching at the right level. You can also see that the need for teaching at the right level varies across these different African contexts. With each teaching at the right level program, it needs to be carefully designed considering context. While there are lots of similarities between India and several African countries that were sort of identified as we thought about the generalizability framework, such as the fact that there's a focus on the curriculum often, in both of or all of these places, and there also seems to be a lot of children in middle to upper primary without foundational skills. But there are also a lot of differences between India and several African countries, and of course differences across these different countries. And so each program needs to be carefully designed considering these things. Some of the things that are carefully considered are things like language. What language will Teaching at the Right Level focus on, and how does that mold the approach that's used in the classroom? What are the existing education programs or approaches that already are in action, and how does Teaching at the Right Level complement these or work with these? What are the existing materials and resources in schools and within the education system? It's really important that the program is grounded in what the school reality is or what the local government reality is. Then this involves thinking about things like, is there space for Teaching at the Right Level to take place within the school? What are the materials that exist within a classroom? We also know that monitoring and mentoring are incredibly important. And so we work closely with government to try and ensure that these support systems are embedded within existing government structures and processes. What are we seeing? We're seeing that children do seem to be making progress. On the right-hand side, you see the proportion of children who can read a simple paragraph, and this is looking at the most recent data from Zambia, Cote d'Ivoire, and Borno State in Nigeria. As you can see, there are large increases between baseline and endline, 20% plus. We see that, well, we think that one of the major reasons why we see these improvements is that at the heart of the program is learning assessment. And so there's a constant desire to improve those learning outcomes. Teaching at the Right Level is growing. In Cote d'Ivoire, it's currently in 200 schools. In Nigeria, it will grow to 500 schools this year. And in Zambia, the program is currently in 2,000 schools. As the program moves to scale in these three different contexts, there's continuous tinkering as we learn about how to maximize the effectiveness of the approach in these different environments. We have learned a lot, but there is a lot more to learn. And across these different countries, we do see some common cross-cutting questions which require further investigation. One of these is around teacher support. So we know from the rigorous evaluations that were conducted in India that there is a lot of need for teacher support, and this is supported by our experience across these different countries. But unlike India, in a lot of the African contexts in which we are working, schools are far apart and there is not good public transport. This can make monitoring difficult to do and can also make it expensive. And so we need to work out ways of trying to keep those costs low. Technology might be one way in which to keep these costs low. Technology might also be one way to encourage data-based action or to spur home-based learning support, which we've been learning about as schools have been closed, and we've had to pivot in some instances to home-based learning support. But we need to learn more about how to effectively utilize technology in these different contexts. These are just two of a few common cross-cutting questions that need to be investigated further. Given the need to learn more, TAL Africa has a learning agenda which fits into three themes. First, teaching learning. Second, teacher support. And third, impact and sustainability. We envision that we will learn about these different topics through a number of different processes or different mechanisms. And we see these different ways of learning about it falling onto a learning continuum. On the one end, through monitoring and response, we believe we'll learn a great deal. Teachers use data to adjust their teaching, and government officials use aggregated data to adjust their support. We can learn a great deal from that. We can also complement what we learn through that through independent processing monitoring. As we learn more about how the program is going, there may be innovations which would be exciting to try. We'd like to try those in learning labs in a few schools to incubate those innovations. The ones that show the most promise could then be piloted through a larger number of schools with lots of monitoring and feedback. And then the innovations that do well there could then be evaluated through impact evaluations. In conclusion, there's been tremendous progress made, but there is still a lot to do. Teaching at the Right Level has reached hundreds of thousands of children across Africa already, and a huge amount has been learned about how global lessons can address challenges in new contexts. That adaptation needs to be done carefully, and it can take time. And there is still a great deal more to learn about how to maximize both the effectiveness and the sustainability of teaching at the right level in Africa. Thank you.